Welcome to TVBS Meeting Room, where we tackle global issues with a view from Taiwan. I'm your host, Wenqi Yu. Today, we have a special program to look at Taiwan's local elections that took place yesterday and their global implications. We're pleased to have with us Chenlung, the deputy managing editor of a leading newspaper, United Daily, in Taiwan, as well as David Sachs, a research fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, specializing in China and Taiwan. He spent a few years at the American Institute in Taiwan, AIT, the de facto U.S. Embassy in Taipei. Welcome. We'll start with Chenlung to give a quick overview of election results. Based on political parties, key municipalities, especially those in the north, where elections were considered most competitive and consequential, Taipei City, New Taipei City, Taoyuan City, Hsinchu City, where TSMC, Foxconn, and other high-tech companies concentrate, as well as Taichung City. Because of the losses, we also saw that President Tsai Ing-wen resigned as DPP's party chairwoman. What does this all mean?
KMT had a landslide, total with 13 municipalities and counties, including 4 out of the 6 major municipalities. But this is only repeating what KMT had gained in 2018, when KMT had captured total 15 municipalities and counties. Since it's only local elections, I think the voters care more about local affairs and individual candidates rather than a relation with China, for instance. But this also shows that there's a genuine dissatisfaction toward the ruling DPP. The ruling DPP suffered a historical defeat at this midterm elections, winning only 5 out of the 22 municipalities. This is DPP's worst ever showing in its whole 30 years of history. However, there's an irony here in this election results. Although KMT is winning, too many people would try to take the credit and seek nomination for the president, which would divide the party. KMT had lost in 2020, it's most likely that it will lose again in 2024. On the contrary, DPP may be losing in this election, but would help DPP to create a sense of crisis and help to consolidate and make sure that the Vice President, William Lai, will win the nomination and subsequently, hopefully, win the election in 2024. Yes.
And David, how do you and the international community read from those results? Was there any surprises to you?
No, I mean, I think that the most important takeaway for the United States and for other countries is just the basic fact that Taiwan held competitive, free and fair elections where voters were able to cast their ballots, they were counted, and losers conceded, and the victor is going to go on to govern. And across the world now, even in the United States, we can no longer take that for granted. And so I think that the biggest takeaway is that Taiwan, again, has shown that democracy is deeply embedded and rooted in Taiwanese society, that democracy is just part of the kind of national identity and the fabric of life. And that's very important. And now we see the juxtaposition with what's happening on the mainland with big protests against the COVID-19 lockdowns, against even Xi Jinping personally. And so really the juxtaposition we're seeing this weekend is quite striking, where you have democracy in action in Taiwan and people in Chinese cities yearning for those same democratic rights and freedoms. So I think that, you know, again, it's very commendable what Taiwan has built and developed in terms of its democracy. And frankly, a lot of countries around the world can learn from Taiwan's example. So I think this was a great weekend for Taiwan, regardless of the results at the ballot box. What I would say, though, as well, is that I think that a lot of analysts in the United States and internationally were far too quick to write off the KMT. A lot of the analysis that you would read from people outside of Taiwan was basically that the KMT was a spent political force, the DPP would be in power indefinitely and that there was no real viable opposition in Taiwan anymore. And I think that that was a flawed analysis. And clearly now we've seen that that was a flawed analysis. So, as was mentioned, I think that, there are still major questions about 2024. I think it will be difficult for the KMT to translate these victories on the local level into victory on the national level in a presidential election. But I also think that we see clearly the KMT still has broad support across Taiwan. It has a very good grassroots campaign infrastructure in place. And so we see that, of course, these competitions are very clearly, fought between the two parties in Taiwan, and it's a healthy democracy in that sense.
I think you have a really good point. A lot of people, especially international media, tends to view Taiwan as this homogeneous, this one entity when, local elections and political parties are actually very competitive. And for anyone who's observed Taiwan's elections would find it almost entertaining and amusing to watch because political parties and candidates have to use all kinds of skills and tactics in order to win the hearts and minds of the people. So on that note, Chenlung, can you actually explain the key campaign platforms the parties ran on? Particularly, you had mentioned that China was not really a real factor, but it seemed that the DPP, the ruling party, did try to make Taiwan, China, or the threat from China more of an issue. Is that right?
Right. I think the KMT, all these candidates have been avoid to mention their China policy during the campaign. Even with the newly elected new Taipei City Mayor, Hou You-yi, who had won more than 1,010,000 votes. He used to be the head of Taiwan police force. Only talk about how the development of the new Taipei city should be. And
why is that? Why did they try to avoid talking about China?
A part of the reason is that actually the KMT is finding itself not in a good position if they want to talk about China policy, especially with Hou. I think he's now the favorite within the KMT to become the presidential candidate, but he had never talked about cross relations or about foreign policy, and this would be his test that in the future everyone will be questioning and grilling him about it.
So it seems like the voters are willing to look at the candidates without factoring in their individual take on China or cross relationship. Is that right?
Yes and no, because on the one hand, it's a local elections, and every issue is regarding whether we need a park or how we should better prepare our schools, so on and so forth. But I noticed that DPP tried to campaign on so-called "Resist China, Protect Taiwan" slogan, but it did not really work. This is because I think it had been very successful in 2020 when Tsai Ing-wen ran for her re-election. At that time, they are using the term called Hong Kong today, Taiwan tomorrow. And everyone was very moved by the slogan saying that we shouldn't be like Hong Kong, especially that was the time when China is putting a tremendous pressure on Hong Kong demonstrations. But this year, when they put on Ukraine today, Taiwan tomorrow, that's a different picture because it now seems for Taiwanese, they are feeling the war is somewhat imminent for them. So if you are choosing this slogan, if you are keep pushing resist China, protect Taiwan now, they don't think it would be proper for them to decide at this moment. They would prefer to make their decision in 2024. I think.
I think fundamentally this is a local election. This is not really a presidential election.
Right,
So
right.
yeah, so the voters really are trying to separate the two.
But another thing is, I think the scare tactics by DPP is not really that effective in a sense, right?
So turning to David, since Chenlung also talked about 2024, it's probably too early to really talk about 2024, but it's also not. And yesterday's election results kind of gave us an insight into who may advance to presidential elections in January 2024. So for example, Hou You-yi, the one that Chenlung mentioned, who's a very popular new Taipei city mayor, and then Jiang Wan-an, who's Chiang Kai-shek's great-grandson and the newly elected Taipei city mayor, are among those who may run for the KMT and enjoy good popularity. And since, President Tsai's power is now weakened within the DPP, the darker green may feel more empowered to push for their candidate. And the current Vice President Lai Ching-te may be the beneficiary, as some say. So how does Washington, D.C. or Taiwan China watchers view those dynamics and those potential candidates?
Yeah, I think you laid it out quite nicely in terms of what the possibilities are at this moment. Clearly, it's much more wide open than it was 24, 48 hours ago in both the KMT and the DPP. So, we don't know who the candidates are going to be right now, but I do agree with your analysis that I think that now that President Tsai has resigned as chair of the DPP, there will be a lot of jockeying between factions and a lot of competition between, let's say the lighter green and the deeper green for who should lead the party. With the KMT, as was just mentioned as well, these people are relatively untested on cross-strait relations. I think that's a fair assessment. And so I think that the KMT still faces a big challenge because at some point it's going to have to articulate a cross-strait position. And in my view, and I think in the KMT's view, it can no longer say the 1992 consensus is the basis for cross-strait relations because you can't really win an election on Taiwan saying that anymore. So I think it's going to be very difficult for the KMT to thread the needle in a way that it can win voters in Taiwan and also make Beijing happy, which is now narrowing, I think, the goalposts a little bit in cross-strait relations, and now wants even more out of the KMT or the DPP in terms of their definition of the political foundation for cross-strait relations. So I think this is a very uncertain period. I will say, though, I think from the U.S. perspective, it doesn't really have a preference for KMT or DPP. But it does, of course, want to see the responsible handling of cross-strait relations. And I think that
what would that be? What does that mean? Responsible handling of cross-strait relations?
I think that President Tsai has done a very good job in the last 6 years of handling cross-strait relations, even though there hasn't been authoritative or official communication between the two sides. I think that at multiple points.
And is that a preferred sort of, having a dialogue, cross-strait dialogue, is that preferred in Washington, D.C.?
Well, I think that a cross-strait dialogue is preferable to no dialogue because that reduces the chances of miscalculation by either side of the strait. But of course, the United States doesn't have a view on what the basis of the cross-strait dialogue should be. It's just that we urge both sides to communicate with each other. I think it's important for Taiwan that it not be seen as the one provoking tensions or escalating tensions. And so I think that to put it back to what we've seen in the last 6 years, in all of these cases, I think that it's pretty much the view is widely shared that Beijing is the one that is inflaming tensions and ratcheting up pressure on Taiwan and not vice versa. And so I think that if Taiwan continues to be seen as the kind of cool, rational actor here that is, trying to de-escalate or trying to find a way forward, that's good for Taiwan's position moving forward. The final thing that I would also say is that, of course, just like every other presidential election, the DPP candidate and the KMT candidate will presumably travel to Washington, meet with senior U.S. officials, and have the opportunity to articulate their vision for U.S.-Taiwan relations and for cross-strait relations. And so I think that that's, of course, an incredibly important visit, to reassure the United States of what their intentions are and what their strategy is, and also to continue to build our bilateral relationship and keep that moving forward. So, I think you have the cross-strait relations. I think that you also have the defense aspect. I think the United States wants to be reassured that there will be a continued commitment to raising defense spending, to pursuing an asymmetric defense strategy, to really investing in Taiwan's deterrent. And regardless of which party comes to power, I think the United States wants to see continuity in that regard.
I'm actually going to ask Guo Chenlung two questions here based on David's response. First is, David thinks that 92 consensus is not going to win the voters if KMT ran on that platform. First of all, do you agree that's the case, or would Taiwanese people actually swing back to that 92 consensus? And then second, for the next few months, like David said, whoever is going to be KMT's presidential candidate will have to come to Washington, D.C. It's a tradition, but it has to have a policy, or it can actually articulate a clear policy about cross-strait as well as its relationship with the U.S. And there's been some kind of, saying that if Taiwan and China become too cozy, it's not that great for the United States. And what is your view? I'm asking a lot of questions.
I think for KMT now, there's two genuine issues for them. One is, how can they produce a candidate that can unite the party and then lead them to victory in 2024? So far, we are seeing Eric Chu have the intention of running again, and also Hou You-yi, and not to mention others. I think this would be a total chaos within the KMT. While we are seeing DPP, they are more united under William Lai. But the other issue would be more severe, would be how they can produce a genuine China program, China policy that can satisfy the most people and the general public. What I mean is that 92 consensus have been the one that want to keep the status quo. But now the status quo had changed, both by Washington and by China. On the China,
can you elaborate on that? What does that mean? The status quo has changed.
I mean, in 2019, in January, Xi Jinping had a speech, literally meaning that China do not consider, China want to push one country, two system, the Taiwan edition of one country, two system, literally meaning that 92 consensus is equal to one country, two system. This is something putting a lot of pressure on KMT, try to redefine what it means. And I think now the tension between the United States and China make it even more difficult for KMT to come up with the same solution for the old problem. Now that they have moving the pole again, I think now is the time for KMT to come up with a new formula, new platform regarding the China policy. Last year, this year, I remember Eric Chu, the chairman of KMT, went to United States and describing 92 consensus as a consensus of non-consensus, meaning agree to disagree. Both China and Taiwan agree at the time, saying there's only one China, but disagree on the content. But this is not really good enough for China. After Eric Chu went back to Taiwan, they demanded the explanation. Hence, the KMT sent out an envoy to China just to explain what they really means. I think KMT haven't really made up their mind how they're going to formulate this China argument. And this would have to be done, have to get the consent from China as well. It's not going to be a one-way street that it's KMT mentioning about what it's going to mean by one China. So I think this is really going to be a tough issue for KMT. And also, I think the US is watching this very carefully, whether this KMT new China policy is somewhat contradicting with what the consensus both Republican and Democrat is having now in Washington.
Mm-hmm.
I would just add briefly that, during the same visit to Washington that Eric Chu made, he also said, that the KMT is often described as a pro-China party, but we're actually a pro-US party.
Right.
And Beijing also was not happy with that comment, but I think that was the KMT trying to signal that actually US-Taiwan relations would continue to grow closer and improve even if they win the 2024 election, because I also think a lot of analysts were saying, well, the KMT would pursue cross-strait rapprochement at the expense of US-Taiwan relations. So I think Eric Chu was trying to clearly state, no, we still want to build US-Taiwan relations, which was a positive message, I think, in the United States. On the 92 consensus and the basis for cross-strait communication, I think to this point the KMT's position has essentially been, well, we're not the DPP, so the mainland knows that they can trust us, and we don't really have to say anything because they basically know that we're not going to go declare independence and we're not going to kind of do anything to really escalate tensions. But I think that that's not necessarily how Xi Jinping views cross-strait relations and what he wants. I think he clearly does want a public articulation akin to the 92 consensus as the political foundation. And so if the KMT were to win in 2024, I don't think that the mainland will let them just get away with saying nothing. I do agree at some point they will need to articulate what their position on cross-strait relations is. And again, I think that will be very, very challenging for them to do.
Let me add one more minute. I think there's also difficulty for the DPP possible candidate, William Lai, because William Lai is not Tsai Ing-wen. So both Washington and China.
What does that mean when you say William Lai, the current vice president, is not Tsai Ing-wen?
William Lai had been saying that he is a practical Taiwan independence workers, meaning that he leaned toward a more Taiwan independence than any politician inside the DPP. And Tsai Ing-wen had been very prudent. I mean, it has satisfied both in Washington as well as China cannot find any excuse to move on Taiwan militarily. So if William Lai had been saying that he's going to follow Tsai Ing-wen's China policy, even when he become a president. He's not saying he become president, saying that as a vice president, I'm of course going to follow President Tsai's China policy. But it's
so he may change. Does that mean he may change if he becomes the president? Is he?
That's how he tried to persuade China and Beijing and Washington that he is going to stick with Tsai Ing-wen's policy even after he becomes the president. That would be a hard job for him to do, right?
Mm-hmm. And how? I do want to ask David on this. How does Washington D.C. view Vice President William Lai?
Well, I think that that's difficult to say because it's very different when you're talking as the vice president or as a legislator and when you're talking as the presidential candidate. So I think that the United, I think that me personally or those who want to see cross-strait peace and stability, we would want to see William Lai articulate something if he were to become the candidate, which is a commitment to maintaining the status quo and, something similar to what President Tsai has said, which is that, Taiwan doesn't need to declare independence because it is already an independent sovereign nation. So I think that there are some kind of creative formulas that William Lai could adopt to signal that he's not looking to create a crisis or to pursue de jure independence under the name Taiwan or Republic of Taiwan or something like that. And so I think that that's really the key question to put forward to any DPP candidate. I think that the real question in Washington, or internationally is the DPP more of the party of Tsai Ing-wen, or is it more the party of Chen Shui-bian? And right now, we don't really have a large sample size to really look at that.
What does that mean when you say a party of Tsai Ing-wen, a party of Chen Shui-bian?
Well, again, Tsai Ing-wen, I think, has handled cross-strait relations really deftly and really responsibly. Chen Shui-bian, I don't think we could say the same about. He was seen as a provocateur, as somebody who was pushing the boundaries as much as he could go. And, then you ended up with Taiwan-U.S. relations really in crisis, without trust in the relationship, and with the stunning scene of President Bush, standing right next to Wen Jiabao, criticizing Chen Shui-bian. And that's not where we want U.S.-Taiwan relations to go in the future. We want to continue to improve the bilateral relationship, to continue to work together on a range of issues. But I think that the fundamental prerequisite for that is for Taiwan to handle cross-strait relations responsibly. And that's what we want to see. So again, I don't think Washington will take a view on what the formula should be. I don't think it'll weigh in and say, you have to say it's the 92 consensus, or you have to come up with something else. It does just want to see that, cross-strait relations are being handled, carefully and responsibly.
But doesn't necessarily mean cross-strait relations being cozy or too warm. Is that right?
Well, I don't think that, I don't think that there's a view either way that we have to see cross-strait relations improve, or I also don't think it's fair to say that the United States wants there to be an impasse between Taiwan and the PRC, or that the United States prefers Taiwan and China to be, at loggerheads. I don't think that's the case. I don't think that this is zero sum in that sense.
Got it.
But yeah.
So last question, since we have limited time, and how do you both think China views the election outcomes?
I think now, after they see that KMT had won a landslide in this local election, they will feel that the time is on the China side, and they maybe is going to have more strategic patience on Taiwan. I hope. Plus, there's a easing of tension between the United States and China these days. And hopefully, by next year or the year in 2024, China would not try to use those military exercise as it used to coerce Taiwan. And because that would be certainly counterproductive. I think it would be wiser for China to sit down and try to work out a way that really acceptable for the people in Taiwan, and either they can go through with KMT, or it's better for them to talk with DPP at the same time.
And I would just add that there has been a debate on whether China essentially is paying lip service to the notion that it's pursuing peaceful reunification, but it has essentially given up on that and is moving towards coercion because that's the only way that it can bring about its objectives. And so I do agree with this analysis that at least for the next couple of years, Beijing will see that the window potentially hasn't closed, that the KMT could win in 2024, and that it could have a partner there. And so I think that this could essentially extend that time horizon, and that would be a good thing. But I would add two caveats. I think that there will continue to be some tense moments in the Taiwan Strait between now and 2024. Kevin McCarthy, who could become the next Speaker of the House of Representatives, has said that he would visit Taiwan as Speaker. I don't think that Beijing will stand aside and basically say, well, it's okay because the KMT won the local elections and we're going to wait until 2024. I think that Beijing would still respond quite forcefully to that trip and to other things that it perceives to be a provocation. So I don't think that it's all going to be kind of clear sailing for the next, 1 to 2 years. So I think that this is still going to be a quite tense situation moving forward.
Yeah, and I'm actually not entirely sure if Beijing still has the same kind of confidence in the KMT in terms of not just winning the elections, but also, sort of being their partner, right? When it comes to at least communicating and being able to talk like when President Ma was the president, because I think the Chinese people have really moved away from that kind of approach. But thank you, both of you, for taking the time. While local elections in Taiwan are primarily driven by individual candidates, local patronage networks, and community issues, Taiwan's public opinion and elected political leaders, especially those with a promising future, are closely watched by international community because they would be consequential in managing cross-strait and U.S.-Taiwan relations. Taiwan's 2024 presidential election is only less than 14 months away. It is likely to be the most consequential election in deciding the future U.S., Taiwan, and China relationships. We'll be providing timely analyses over the next few months. And thank you, Guo Chenlung and David Sachs, for joining us today, especially on a Sunday. So take care.